So,
Did you guys hear any of the stuff that we've said so far?
No,
No.
it just barely started.
Perfect. All right. Well, we had a false start, so we will start again. Thank you. Sorry about that.
okay. So I can do it again. Yes. Good morning, everybody. Welcome again for those of you that heard me the first time, and welcome for the first time to the Maricopa Regional Continuum of Care Committee meeting. All those around the table, turn on your microphone, make sure that it's green. If you're on the Zoom, make sure that you're not muted. If we are talking to the Zoom, make sure that we're not muted as well. Please state your name when making a comment or asking a question, and mute when you are not speaking so we don't have to hear your cats. The MAG public comment process allows members of the public to comment on items on today's agenda or on items that fall under MAG's jurisdiction. If you would like to comment at today's meeting, please fill out a white request to speak card located on the information table and give it to MAG staff. If you're in the audience today, please remember to sign into the information table so we know who is here. And if you parked in the garage, parking validators are available on the information table. If you purchased a ticket to get here via transit, holla at the staff and they'll hook you up with that as well. Hearing assisted devices are available for MAG staff. We will now again ask Haley to proceed with a second roll call. Please indicate that you are here and your organization after Haley calls your name.
Thank you. Michelle Alberti. Don Bogart. Vanessa Carthel. Ashley Ziganuck for Allison Cook Davis.
Here for the Morrison Institute.
Thank you. Callie Lamers for Aaron Cowan Haig.
Allie Lamer, Save the Family.
Thank you. Stephanie Crum. Nicole Gibson.
Is that you, Mom?
Thank you. Anne Marie Johnston. Thank you. Thank you. Christina Lopez.
Christina Lopez for Native American Connections.
Thank you. Marcy McFarland.
Marcy McFarland, Home Inc.
Jim McPherson.
Good morning, everyone. Jim McPherson, PCA Social and Housing Advancement Committee.
Thank you. Reina Padilla Guzman.
Present, Chicanos por la Causa.
Thank you. Jennifer Page.
Good morning, Jennifer Page, Mercy Care.
Thank you. Aaron Rain.
Good morning, Aaron Rain, City of Mesa.
Thank you. Patricia Scott Lopez. Sarah Sims. Sarah, I can see you're on, but I can't hear you.
How about now?
Perfect.
Sarah Sims, Phoenix Elementary.
Thank you. Laura Scott Nicky.
Scott Nicky, the Salvation Army. Good morning.
Thank you. Michelle Stokes. Christopher Wallace. Emily Walsh.
President with Maricopa County.
Thank you. Co-chair Nathan Smith.
Here, Phoenix Rescue Mission.
Thank you. Co-chair Richard Cruz.
Present, Human Services Campus.
Perfect. Did I miss anybody? Awesome. Back to you, Co-chair Cruz.
The next item on the agenda is a call to the audience. This is the opportunity for the public to comment on items that fall under the Continuum of Care Committee that are not on the agenda or that are on the agenda for discussion and not for action. That means, like, if you have something that's burning within you, this is for those that are like on when you watch it on YouTube. Like, it's really good for you to be here in person, so this way you can participate as opposed to just talking about it for the next 30 days amongst each other. But this is the opportunity for the public to comment on items that fall under the Continuum of Care Committee that are not on the agenda or that are on the agenda for discussion and not for action. 15 minutes will be provided for the call to the audience agenda item unless the committee requests an exception to this limit. MAG staff, were there any comments received or anyone who has joined the call to offer comments?
There were no public comments received or members of the audience wishing to speak at this time.
Thank you. So now we'll move on to the next agenda item. Approval of the consent agenda. Consent agendas will approve multiple items at the same time. Committee members can always ask for an agenda item to be pulled off the consent agenda to be heard during the meeting, at which time staff can provide additional information, give a presentation, and answer any questions. Does any member of the committee have questions or comments on the consent agenda?
Richard, it's Laura. I just had one comment on the minutes from last month. On item 4, there's just a typo in the second row. It says entered into a contact with home base, and I think it's supposed to be contract.
So too.
Thank you so much. We will make sure that is corrected.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other comments on the consent agenda? Hearing none, can I have a motion to approve the consent agenda?
Motion to approve.
Okay, it has been moved. Is there a second? Okay, so it's been moved and seconded. For note-taking purposes, do you have the names that made the motion and seconded the motion? Okay, so who made the motion? Laura?
Laura.
Laura Scott Nikki? Okay, so Laura made the motion. Who seconded it?
And Marcy McFarland.
Marcy? Okay, there we go. Okay. So is there discussion of the motion? Hearing none. For committee members in the room, we will do a voice vote. Those in favor, please say yay. Yay. Those opposed? Okay, for members joining remotely, I will ask Haley to proceed with a roll call vote. Please indicate how you vote, stating yay or nay after your name is called.
Thank you. Ashley Ziganek for Allison Cook Davis.
Yay.
Callie Lamers for Aaron Cowan Hay.
Yay.
Christina Lopez.
Yay.
Jim McPherson.
Aye.
Jennifer Page.
Yay.
Aaron Rain.
Yay.
Sarah Sims.
Yay.
Laura Scott Nikki.
Yay.
Emily Walsh.
Yay.
Did I miss anyone? Great. Back to you.
Awesome. Thank you. Okay, so then we will now move on to the next agenda item. So we have the pit count presentation. Each year, the Maricopa County Continuum of Care completes the point in time count as part of a requirement from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, also known as HUD. The point in time count includes a count of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness as well as a sheltered count. The full report provides a breakdown of total population, demographic subpopulations, and population by jurisdiction. MAG staff will provide an overview of the full report.
Thank you, Richard. Next slide, please. A quick overview of the purpose of the count. The count is required by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, as Richard just mentioned. It is required to do on an every other year basis, but Maricopa County has always done it on an every year basis. And really, it's to track trends over time at the national level, and is included as part of the annual homelessness assessment report that is supplied to Congress each year. The communities identify important data on the topics, including subpopulations, and those are highlighted throughout the AHAR when it is presented to Congress. Next slide. This year we saw an increase, so our total numbers were 9,642. Thank you. The majority of those were just slightly on the unsheltered side, so 4,908 unsheltered and 4,754 sheltered. Next slide. Looking at a comparison year over year, we did see an increase of 7%, with all of that increase coming from the sheltered count. So we had an 18% in increased shelter and a slight decrease of unsheltered of 2%. Next slide. Now I'm going to break down the different subpopulations that we track throughout the count. So the first subpopulation is families. We've continued to see a slight increase year over year, and a total of 563 people and families were captured in this year's count. The majority of these are captured in shelters. Families are historically very hard to find within the point in time count. because they are one of those more difficult populations. We have been working with the Family Housing Hub to reach out to the Priority 1 and Priority 2 lists on the night of the count, and we're successful this year in contacting people on that wait list. Next slide. We saw a dramatic increase in our chronically homeless this year, up to 1,906. The majority of this increase came from our sheltered population. So that blue dotted line, as you see, is the sheltered, with the orange being the unsheltered, seeing a slight increase year over year. Next slide. We continue to see this kind of influx of veterans as well, and the majority of those also being in the sheltered count. We've seen a stagnant number of unsheltered in our veterans number. In the point in time count, this is self-reported veterans, so none of these are confirmed VA status or their eligibility through the VA for the day of the count. Next slide. Our last subpopulation is unaccompanied youth, which would be ages 18 to 24. We did see a slight decrease from last year, and that decrease being in the unsheltered count. This, similar to the families, they are very difficult to find, but we've been working with youth providers to better locate youth on the night of the count. Next slide. Gonna quickly go through some breakdown of demographics. The majority of the folks that we find are male, so 6,188 male, 3,400 female, and then 54 identify as transgender, questioning, or gender non-conforming. Next slide. This year, for the first time, we did HUD asked us to break down age groups by groups of 10. So seeing kind of different trends than previous years, because previously we had 25 to 62 all in the same age group. So the majority are that kind of mid-range adult in that 25 to 44 range, but did find quite a few older adults this year for the first time, and seeing that 18 to 24 number slowly creep up. Next slide. Similar to the homelessness trends report, we do see an overrepresentation in Black or African American, American Indian, and American Indian or Alaska Native. And then similarly, we see kind of Hispanic or Latino representing slightly lower than the census data that we see. But this is very in line with our homelessness trends report and system flow dashboard. Next slide. The last thing that we look at in the point in time count is our additional populations. This is all based off of self-report of mental illness, substance use, HIV and AIDS, and then fleeing domestic violence. So as you can see, we've continued to see an increase on those across the board on all of these, but specifically in mental illness and substance use, which did show our increase in chronic homelessness as well. Next slide. We asked some subsequent questions to people that are interviewed. We asked the question this year of, did your rent increase directly cause your homelessness? And 440 people said yes. That was quite surprising. And I was part of the count this year and heard personal stories of people's homelessness being a direct response of their rent increasing. So that was some really interesting data, and we're hoping to continue to follow up with that over time, as we know the economic impacts of rent increases are impacting our folks. We also asked, similarly to last year, that did COVID-19 directly impact your homelessness? We saw a decrease of this year comparatively to our 2022 count, but did see an increase in pets and how many pets were found on the street this year. Next slide. So how do we use this data? As many of you know, this is really just one source of data that we use across regional planning and to work through our homelessness planning. The other thing is, throughout the count, we are trying to connect people with resources, but really find that we are mapping data, comparing to HMIS data, and really using it as a one point in time to then work through next steps. Next slide. Some benefits and limitations of the point in time count. I know I'm preaching to the choir on many of these, but the purpose of the count is part of our HUD dollars coming into the community. It's a required count for us, and it does provide useful data for planning purposes. However, it is difficult to measure certain subpopulations. The data is all self-reported, and we know it does not give us a full picture of homelessness. This year alone, we had a freeze warning in effect, so we know that maybe we didn't capture everybody that we could have captured on a different night because they were staying with a family or friend or difficult to find that morning. Next slide. Want to give a huge shout out to all of the pit count coordinators and volunteers. We had over 1,500 volunteers out across the region that morning, as well as the shelter count that happened at the same time, and we could not have done it without all of you. Next slide. Next slide. Happy to answer any questions that you all have.
Okay. There we go. Okay. I was like, I caught it. So do we have any comments or discussion from the committee on what we've seen? Okay, so the point in time count also included crickets. Because
I'm
nobody's
sorry. This is Jim. Katie, can you go back to the slide about next steps or what folks are working on? I was just wondering, are there additional things that we could do or, our partners can do and just. Okay, here we go. I'm going to screenshot this for me. And okay, this is helpful. Thank you.
Jim, it's also available online too.
Got it. Okay, cool.
What would the possibility be? I'm just curious. If the point in time count, as opposed to being on one morning, was over 3 mornings, for example, or 3 days, and then like we took the median of that, so this way we can have a more accurate count. Because every year, like it's a great thing to look at the trends, but one of the conversations that we always have at the end of the pit count is that it's not right? Like I struggle with the numbers saying that the unsheltered count is down, because my eyes tell me different than that, both in terms of what I see in front of the campus, but also in terms of what I see in every other neighborhood that I drive in throughout Maricopa County. And so like we know the data is a data point, but we also know the data is not right. So like, is that something that would be possible for next year to try? Like if we did multiple counts over the course of a week and then tabulated that, or would that be in violation of HUD?
I would have to let Katie speak to the violation piece. But I would say just from a practical standpoint, it may be difficult to galvanize that many volunteers over a number of days, and then you would likely get duplicative information. So then, which already happens, and so then I would say the biggest barrier would be it would take a lot longer to get all the information out to you guys. So right now we have the count in January, it's now May, and we're barely getting the information to you. That would probably be extended even more because of all the work that would have to be done on the back end. I also think that this is why we don't rely solely on this pit count, and why we really push the dashboard that we use, because that is a better, that gives a lot more information about who's engaging with the system and how often, so we can see better trends rather than this year over year.
Okay.
So sorry, Katie, didn't mean to steal any of your thunder, but definitely want to open it for you if you have anything to add.
Yeah, 100% agree kind of with all the comments that Haley made. In addition, HUD does not allow for a multiple count in their current methodology. There are many COCs that are really pushing HUD to move away from the point in time count because of the flawed methodology that you all just mentioned. There is some communities do a multi-day count to try to capture as many people as possible, but it has been really challenging to move in that direction because of that de-identify or like kind of deduplicating folks over time and not being able, because we know how mobile folks are, and even the morning of the count, people move from, by the time you're touching somebody at 6 a.m. in one neighborhood, they may have moved and be running into another volunteer a couple hours later. So we've always stayed with kind of that morning, not to say that that methodology is completely off the table. The other comments that we have received and have considered in the past is doing the count at a different time. So right now we start the count at 5 a.m. and folks have encouraged the count to happen later because we're waking folks up and things like that. Previously, I want to say about 10 years ago is when we made the shift from a night count to a morning count, and had kind of the same challenges at night, not being able to find people. So definitely open and considering all things, and having conversations with jurisdictions about what they think is the best way to be able to capture all of those people while still maintaining the volunteer counts that are needed and kind of being able to still operate all of the other activities that we have going on that day. But happy to discuss more if you're interested too.
Thank you, Katie. And just to make a point, sorry, it's really loud. Just to make a point though, like I acknowledge that there would be duplication. That's actually the point, is the fact that like if we're doing it over multiple days, it's not to say like we're breaking the count up to cover different areas. It's to say like, if we're looking at various areas, like somebody would be counted 3 times, and then of course we have to do the deduplication. And I also get that cause for a longer period of time, or it may not, depending on like maybe we staff it differently. Maybe we look at, you know, different ways that we could do that. Maybe it's just outreach teams and it's not volunteers that do it. I don't know. I just think that like we have to acknowledge like we're in a different space around this issue, and doing it the way that we've done it, like I just feel like, and I'll come off of my soapbox. I just feel like if other communities can try things that are innovative, so can we. Laura Scott Nicky.
Yes, I just had a quick question on the additional populations. Obviously, there was a substantial jump in mental illness and domestic violence. Has there been any talk about next year's count possibly adding a question for have you sought mental health assistance, or on the domestic violence question, do you need immediate assistance, or how can we connect you to assistance?
Laura, I don't think either of those have been brought up, but definitely will take notes and consider that for next year. We do, on the domestic violence side, we do offer a resource sheet and try to get folks connected if they are interested in getting connected. But it's more kind of overall resources rather than kind of in the moment, we are going to call a domestic violence hotline with you being there, similarly to how we've done with veterans in the past. So definitely thank you for the suggestions, and can definitely consider them as we move into 2024.
Thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts, comments, etc.?
I do have one other question. Obviously, we know many of our homeless individuals have pets or those living on the street. I'm wondering, I mean, it's great information to know that there were 439 pets counted. I'm not sure what our plan is to do with that information. Is the plan to make more shelters lower barrier to accept pets? I was just curious the rationale of how we see that question moving forward.
Happy to take that one. I think how we initially started asking this question is we had some folks interested in offering services to pets, and so have started asking that question. We've even been asked to capture that in HMIS as well. So the hope is that we can better do outreach to folks with pets, but love the suggestion of having that conversation with shelters too, and figuring out how do we have lower barriers for shelters. I know Washington Street has specifically done that in response. They have a companion animal program. And so how do we continue to do that over time too with additional shelters?
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah, and I just want to add to what Katie was saying. I have been doing more work in the youth homelessness space, and I know a lot of the contracts that have been executed recently have requested that the shelters have space or allow pets to be at that shelter. So it does seem like this is helping move that in the right direction.
I have a question. Katie, you mentioned that I think the 65 plus group was going up. Is that identified specifically in the report? And if so, where's it at? Because I can't seem to see it.
It's specifically in the age groups on page 3, I believe, but I can pull that and send it over to you too, Dave.
Okay. If it's in there, I should be able to find it. That little guy. Yeah, I see that right there. But it's not year over year.
I think this is the first year that we broke it out to that like specificity of age groups, and previous to that, it was only like sort of all lumped together. If I'm understanding that correctly, Katie, please correct me if I'm wrong.
That is correct, Haley.
Okay.
But we can definitely get you the slide from here so you can see what that information looked like for this count. You just won't have that comparison for year over year because this is the first time that we had done that.
Right, gotcha. Want to clarify, first time that we asked like age grouping. So we don't have a data that separates a 65 plus population specifically from the past. Am I hearing that right?
I will defer to Katie.
Okay.
Yeah, in previous years, we captured it the same way that we capture in HMIS as 62 plus. And so it's a slightly different grouping, but our age range for 65 plus did go up from last year's 62 plus.
Got you. Okay. So we have more people who are experiencing homelessness at 65 plus than last year's 62 plus. And our system performance trends, the data that matters most because it's the most reliable, has consistently shown that troubling upward trend in senior homelessness. So if there's something, I don't know that we have a bunch of, maybe we can talk about it in the connecting to other systems of care work group and bring that offline. But we're just right now looking to identify where the gaps may be. And it seems the data is pointing to seniors among other things. So just wanted to point that out, and I'm done.
Yes. Okay. So moving forward, I do just want to say though, like to push people towards the systems trends dashboard, because we know over the next 12 months that a number of people will use this data to say like, there's no homelessness in Litchfield Park, while staring at homeless people from Litchfield Park. So just encouraging people to do that so that these tools are not weaponized against the populations that we serve, and around why people think they don't have to create interventions in those particular spaces. Okay, moving forward, the community standards aims to provide data benchmarks for program operations to improve overall system performance. Dylan, Human Services Planner with MAG, will provide an overview of the draft tool. Go ahead, Dylan.
Thank you, co-chair. So here to talk about performance standards today. The full report was included in the agenda packet for both the singles and family side. This was brought to the committee previously earlier this year, so it may sound a little bit familiar, but essentially performance standards are just a way to set standards for performance, right? So we're bringing together data benchmarks that sort of contextualize these common metrics used to evaluate programs, which in turn ideally should encourage program improvement. To break this down a different way, an example would be, an agency, let's call them agency A, is looking at their returns data and, using these performance standards, they see compared to the whole system, their returns are a little bit higher, right? So that might be a red flag. showcase that there's an opportunity for improvement, and then focus on that area in particular. So for the purposes of this conversation, it might be easier to break the performance standards down into two different parts. The criteria, as I mentioned, was brought to the committee earlier this year, really focuses on what should be measured. Going through it, the main priorities were really about, what criteria has impact on performance, what criteria is easily pulled from HMIS or other sources, and do these criteria make sense? Is it very obvious what it's actually measuring? So those criteria went through the committee cycle and were approved by the board. So based on those criteria, then it's getting those data benchmarks in the first place, right? So now that you have them, where is it set? A couple things to point out just to contextualize this information. A lot of the data points do come from multiple sources. Primarily, it's HMIS. We want those objective standards. So it provides weighted averages for the entire system on all of those criteria. Some of the other criteria, though, aren't as set in stone, I guess, or focused from HMIS. So those are pulled from various best practices documents that the COC has developed over the past few years. I'll call out a few of those when we look at the full document. Also, it should be noted that, maybe it's not necessarily fair to compare income growth from emergency shelters to permanent supportive housing programs, right? So all of these are broken down further into each specific program type, and then singles and family programs as well. And then just a last bit, these standards are set using data from this date range, October 2021 to September 2022. This matches like the federal reporting date for system performance measures, and same date range that was used for the Notice of Funding Opportunity Scorecard. Obviously, this is going to be way too small for anyone to see, but just wanted to throw it up there just so we can sort of get an idea of what it looks like. You can see all the criteria on the left, as well as each program type having its own column. You'll see some of those boxes being grayed out because not every criteria is going to be relevant, bless you, for each program type. And yeah, certainly this also, the main focus today is the data, right? This visual will almost certainly be updated, so it's pretty and much easier to understand when providers are pulling it. But essentially the goal will be for this document to be publicly accessible. That way, when providers are able to pull their own report from HMIS to compare this, it'll be quite simple. Great. So with that in mind, with all of that lovely context out of the way, there are a few things that we specifically wanted to hear from this committee on as these are being developed, right? Because it's of paramount importance that this is led by the community, and this is only a baseline, right? The data that's included from these system-wide averages are a way to see where the system's at, so these benchmarks can be set, but it doesn't mean that the numbers that are there right now need to stay that way. So definitely want to open it up to questions in general, but just some things to start thinking about as we talk about it. First thing is, now that we have this data in mind, is there anything that maybe should be removed? There are, potentially some that could look weird, and it's, maybe not the best idea to include that as part of the performance standards. Or, it could even be narrowed down to, for a specific criteria, maybe it's good and it's helpful, but maybe not for emergency shelter, if that makes sense. I threw up a few there that maybe we want to look at annual income growth, for example, there's both median and average length of stay. There's a question of should both be included or should just one be focused on? And then chronicity as well is a criteria that's included, and it does provide meaningful data. There is just a question of, if it should be included in as a standard or if it's just, something interesting to know. And then really like the crux of this all is where should these numbers be set? So when seeing this data from the whole system, are any of these way too high? Do we want to look at, instead of, averages, setting them a little bit above? So there really can be that encouragement of improvement. So that's it for the contextualization. With that in mind, would really love to hear any feedback. Can also pull up the full report if that's helpful.
Okay, what feedback do we have? And thank you, Dylan.
I got a couple questions. So the data that is like, so the targets in the sheet are built on that date range as a baseline, but is that true for every single one of these? For instance, I look at street outreach and engagement enrollment has 67%, which I don't think is last year's baseline.
So glad that you brought that up. Sorry, I forgot to go back to this, but street outreach engagement and street outreach enrollment, both of those actually are two of the ones that weren't pulled from HMIS. Those were actually set in, I think it was in 2017, the COC created a sort of street outreach best practices document. And those were two of the sort of guidelines
Right,
that
that's
were
that
set.
same number. Yeah,
Yep.
yeah.
It was like 2/3 of clients should be. Another one along that same line, data timeliness and data completeness. Those are both pulled from the current HMIS data quality plan, which was approved by the board, I think, earlier this year.
Okay. The reason I say that is because it would be helpful to establish real baselines instead of using those targets. I remember being a part of the people setting those targets in 2017, and it would be nice to see if we could get something that is built on actual data rather than carrying those over, 6 years later, we're still looking at 67%. I have no idea if that's really realistic or not. So, I think that would be wise to do.
Yeah, thank you for that suggestion. I think I do still have, we did pull the data. Let me see if I can bring it up real quick, and I'll circle back and bring it up.
And then, so the definitions, because I know where to find some of these things, but maybe not all of them. Where can providers who are interested in checking this do two things? One, find the definitions for the things on the side. I guess it's just what it says right there. That's the extent of the definition, say, for all of the things on there. Is just a little subtext under it.
Yeah.
Okay. And then what would a provider do to check their progress? Is it off of an APR report? Is there a community level dashboard?
Right. So our current plan is Solari is going to be building reports. Also, shout out to Solari. Sorry, I haven't said that yet, but they obviously helped a lot with the data. So providers will be able to pull a specific report that has all of these criteria included in it. Obviously, most of them are from the APR annual performance report, but just bringing it all in one location.
That'd be awesome. Okay, sweet. Thank you.
I'm sorry, did I answer your first question? I don't remember.
Yes, I think there is places where the subtext
definitions
lacks clarity still.
Right.
I've the street outreach engagement and enrollment keep coming to mind because they have like the definition is in there. So it's percentage of unduplicated street outreach engagement is percentage of unduplicated individuals contacted who become engaged. What does engaged mean? Right. So it lacks clarity. That's why I wondered if there were other further definitions of those things somewhere. If not, they're finding the places where that clarity is lacking and bringing clarity to it would be helpful. That was just an observation.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful to hear. I think that like as this report goes out and is posted, having an additional explainer document for any of those definitions that are still unclear is totally doable.
Thank you and great job.
Nicole.
Yeah, this is Nicole from UMOM. I wanted to talk a little bit about chronicity, especially as it relates to rapid rehousing programs. Just because the nature of rapid rehousing is meant to be kind of like a middle line intervention. So the ability to get chronically homeless clients is limited by the definition of them coming into rapid rehousing. So I'm just curious around, I'm guessing the intent around it is to kind of just serve whoever you get. And I don't know that putting a specific mark on how many chronically homeless you have is maybe the right way to get that. It's just something like as a program, we very rarely return referrals. However, we never rarely meet this number ever. And so I'm wondering if the intent behind it, I guess, is to serve whoever you get. Maybe a better measure might be just a percentage of referrals returned, like denied, versus targeting a specific like chronicity, because they're kind of discounted from rapid programs. So.
Nicole, I think, sorry, this is Katie. Dylan and I have had a lot of conversations about this, and we had some funders say it would be helpful to have chronicity to give context to the other numbers in this report, not as a benchmark to say you're serving this many people chronic. So if you're serving like 100% chronic people, maybe your income is lower because you're having a harder time getting them income type of thing. So I think it's more, and I think why Dylan asked, like, should this metric be removed or not, is not to say you should serve 17% of rapid should be chronic, but rather this is the average in our system right now. And does this give any context to some of these other numbers in this report, so that we're not holding people like to different, slightly different accountabilities based off of the population you're serving? Does that help?
Yes, thank you. Nicole again, if no one else has another comment.
And Marie.
Oh, Maria.
I just have a question about the positive exits, because it doesn't look like that we're looking at that for PSH. And so I'm wondering if that's something that could be included or should be, maybe to sort of monitor how we're working out move-on strategies from our PSH projects.
Yeah, so specifically for PSH, there is a criteria at the very bottom of that page that's specific to it. That includes both retention of permanent housing or positively exiting it. Do you think that would cover that, or should it be included in a different manner?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I also wanted to mention, as I'm seeing this chart and seeing all the items that are taken into consideration for each program, a lot of what was said earlier regarding the reason why they become homeless is the rent increasing. So for those, what Katie had mentioned, who have limited income and who have that chronic homelessness, as we're receiving the clients who are in the transitional housing program and rapid rehousing program, I would like to see maybe, I do see, increase in income, but those who are also affected of that limited income and not being able to have a second job, because then they'll lose their benefits. So really capturing who those are that really cannot increase their income because rent is increasing and there's like no way for them to even make ends meet with the food increasing and all of that. So maybe also including that little section on there.
Yeah, I think that's a definitely a great point. I think partially to address this, that was the inclusion of receipt of outside benefits. So for those who aren't able to increase income, just making sure that eligibility for other programs are included as part of that.
Awesome. Nicole, I think you had one more, and then we got to move.
Yeah, just for the acceptance of the coordinated entry referrals, the percentage eligible accepted, does that mean if it's not 100%, the agency denied or refused those referrals, or are they accepting referrals not from coordinated entry?
Yeah, to your earlier point, I think this criteria could probably be adjusted a little bit to include, your earlier suggestion about denials, just to provide that clarity and give that more context. Yeah.
Okay. If there are other questions, please reach out to Dylan.
Sorry, Co-Chair. I wanted to follow up on the street outreach one.
Oh, okay.
So we do have the data for it. It just wouldn't work in this category. It needs to be adjusted a little bit more because it's just like the raw numbers, but it doesn't take into account like the size of an outreach team. So it's like, how many did they contact? Well, obviously that's going to be different depending on, that team's capacity. So would just need to be adjusted further, but these performance standards are going to be going through plenty more committees this month before ending at the board. So definitely still time for all of this information to still be adjusted. Definitely recommend, if there are any further comments or questions in the meantime, please feel free to email me and we can share those updates.
Great. Thank you, Dylan.
Awesome. Okay. Now handing it over to Nathan Smith.
Yeah, we're going to talk about we're going to get a presentation from the data analytics work group. The data analytics work group is a group of COC involved individuals from various agencies and roles with interest, capacity, and knowledge of analytics and HMIS data. Facilitated by MAG and supported by the Solari HMIS team, they met regularly from November 2022 through April 2023 to focus on a descriptive analysis of returns to homelessness. Randy Haid with UMOM and others will share an update on their findings. Randy, take it away.
Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
Great. All right, and I'm sharing my screen now. All looks good. So myself and Andrew are going to present a little bit today. We're going to try to talk for only 15 minutes, but then plenty of time for discussion after that. Let's see. So the first thing is, I just want to describe the data a little bit. Returns, you all are more familiar than most, but we have exits in a 2-year period. So exits between October 2018 and September 2020. And then the way returns work is in 2 years after that, we are looking for those individuals to return to the system. So this is exits to permanent housing in 2 years, and then 2 years after that, did somebody return? So you can see it ends up being kind of a small subset, right? If overall we're exiting about 13% to permanent housing, and then it breaks down further from there. So we're dealing with the yellow over here. Returns to homelessness doesn't include if somebody moved from emergency shelter into rapid rehousing and then returned. That would be a return from rapid rehousing, not a return from shelter. If you're transferring from one program to another, that's tried to be excluded from the data.
Randy?
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt you. We are just having a technical issue over on our end, so we can't see your screen. So just give us one moment.
Okay.
Okay, it looks like we're good now. Sorry about that.
Great. Okay. So, yeah, like I said, it doesn't count a transfer between a transitional project into a permanent housing project as a return. And yeah, we'll dive in now.
Hi all, this is Andrew speaking. Just some of the big pools of the data that we were looking at. Overall, we found a return rate of 24% across all programs. On the right here, you can see that return rate broken down by program type. And so you see street outreach and emergency shelter were had the highest rates of return, which I don't think is very surprising. And then down at the bottom, we see transitional housing and permanent supportive housing having lower rates of return. In terms of overall volume, which you can see at this bar at the bottom, emergency shelter by and large had the total number of exits and the largest number of returns as well, with rapid being about half that. And then you can see it kind of decreases going on. So while street outreach had the highest rate, it actually had a small pool of total returns. And there could be a lot of reasons for that. It's like someone going from street outreach to shelter before they exit. They would be marked as an exit from shelter and not from street outreach. Randy, next slide. We looked at time to reappear, primarily by project type. And you can see in that chart on the right, you can see, at the top we have a shelter, then transitional housing, SH is supportive housing, transitional housing, emergency shelter, street outreach, rapid housing, and permanent supportive housing. And in general, there you want a longer time to reappear. The longer, the shorter returns are, someone left the program and came right back. And on average, if we're looking at the months to reappear, this distribution here at the bottom, you see that it is fairly flat on that right end of the tail, but those first 3 months have a higher rate of return than the other months. And that was a key finding. And there's a little bit of a peak in the middle you see there, right around 12 months. And we'll get into that when we get into rapid rehousing. But those first 3 months, especially with emergency shelter, seem to be critical. We can go to the next slide, Randy. In terms of influencing factors, we looked at a bunch of things that could be contributing factors to these return rates. And a lot of these, again, unsurprising, but in terms of times the individual experienced homelessness in the past 3 years, 4 or more times has a higher rate of return than someone who this was their first time experiencing homelessness. Again, as well as to how many months they had experienced homelessness for. If they've been experiencing homelessness for more than 12 months, that correlated with a higher return rate. We saw similar trends with people who had a disabling condition or who were chronically homeless. One of the things we analyzed was how many, or if there were any programs that were specific outliers that we could, or high performers, especially, that we could pull best practices from. And what we found was that overall, programs that served a specific program types, for example, our emergency shelter, were kind of clustered together. And you can see that in these bubbles. These larger bubbles represent the number served by each program, the size of the program, and the colors correspond to what program type they are, with green being emergency shelter, yellow being permanent supportive housing, blue being rapid rehousing, that reddish color being street outreach, and that orange being transitional housing. There are still a couple of outliers over here, but we found that those corresponded more to the population served rather than the provider themselves. Over on the right, for example, that one that has over a 50% return rate, that was a hotel program for high risk individuals. And over on the left was a transitional housing program, that orange out far on the left, and that required clients to already have a job and some built-in stability. So in terms of population served, that was a much larger indicator of return rates as compared to which provider or which provider it was, or anything like that. One of the big takeaways that we did have from this is that even in general, higher acuity individuals, were correlated with higher returns, and the exception to that was permanent supportive housing. Despite them typically having higher acuity clients, those programs tended towards lower return rates, much lower than our 24% average. All right, Randy, I think we're good to the next slide. So we have a few more influencing factors here. We did look at race and ethnicity to see if there were any trends in those areas. And what we found is that overall, the return rates corresponded very closely to our overall return rate. And that's not to say that that this is a perfectly equitable system, but only in this narrow slice of data we did not find any racial discrepancies that we could identify. We also, one of the other interesting findings that we found was when we sorted the return rates by exit destinations, exiting to a permanent housing exit that was identified as staying or living with friends correspond with a higher return rate than other exit destinations. And while that's a smaller number overall, it was high enough that we included it in our findings. All right, Randy. Randy's now going to talk a little bit about rapid rehousing specifically and some of the findings we found in regards to that.
All right, so we're filtered down here on this page into rapid rehousing projects only. There's kind of a lot going on, so I'll take a minute to walk through it. This bar up here has exits to permanent housing in these blue bars. So that's the height of a blue bar is the count of exits to permanent housing, with dark blue being no return and light blue being return. And the way it's broken up is the length of subsidy. So that's calculated from your move-in date, your housing move-in date to the end of your program. And so this one here is 0 to 29 days of housing subsidy. And then it goes by month blocks. This one here in the middle is 240 to 269 days or something, which is around 8 to 9 months of subsidy. So you can see here with the yellow line being the return rate, that there's this peak around this 8 to 9 month mark, where if you receive 8 to 9 months of subsidy, that group has a higher return rate, is slightly more likely to return than people receiving other subsidy lengths. So I wanted to unpack that with you all a little bit. So we'll come back to that in a second. Over here, we have it broken off by funder type. This is a little wonky, right? DES and ESG DES are the same program. We're just using the coding that's in the EDAs of the HMIS. And you can see here, I'll sort this by funder type. Nothing's too crazy out of whack. And then these smaller numbers are going to have wilder percentages too. Down here at the bottom, so this one's calculated, this one up top is your move-in date to the end of your program. So just the length of subsidy and then your return later, whenever your return was, months or a year and a half later. This one is looking at the time between your move-in date and the day you return. So move-in date, past your program exit date, all the way to your return back to the system. And we see here in the distribution that we have a peak is at about 15 months. Each bar is a month. Height of the bar is volume of returns. We can see that around 15 months, we have the peak of the distribution here. So about 15 months after somebody leases up is when they're most likely to return. Obviously, this lump's pretty big and it's spread out. With this the gray bars being before 12 months and this being after 12 months. So this idea is that this represents when your lease renewal might be, is around this 12-month mark. And so we see the majority of people, we see a higher increase in people returning immediately following that, that 12-month, when their 12-month lease would be up. So I'm going to stop here, and this is where, so on the next slide, we'll get into some of the recommendations that we brainstormed in our working group, like that was working with the data. But really, we all felt that we wanted, that we really need like your all's perspective or like program leaders' perspective on like, on what's going on here in the data. And if you can tie that to things that are happening in real life. My first question is, knowing that this data is from, what was it, October, you know, basically 2019 and 2020. Was there things happening back then that were maybe like, I don't know, external factors that were pressuring rapid providers to, you know, to end somebody's length of stay around the 8 or 9 month mark? Does anyone know?
Hi, Nicole from UMOM. We are a rapid provider and we have several different contracts. I can speak a little bit to the difference in funders. We do have some funders that have quite a long and uninvolved oversight on how long a client can stay in services. So it's really determined by the case manager and what the household needs. And then we have some providers who give a very strict specific, they have to be exited at 9 months. So whether the client needs the additional services or not, that exit needs to happen. Or there are also some providers who have the 9 month kind of goal. And if you want to provide additional assistance, there's an approval process that has to happen from the contract administrator, which sometimes can slow the process. So they end up getting exited anyway, or the help that could be provided is no longer relevant because there's other issues that now will not save them from losing their housing. So there is a wide range of provider restrictions,
Right.
how things are managed.
And Nicole, do you find, I mean, I don't want to assume, but then would you find that the projects where you have less leniency to extend people as based on their need, and would you find that those stricter projects have higher return rates?
I do. And, you know, we're fortunate enough to have several different funding sources. So when I see someone come in who has a higher VI score, someone who maybe has been homeless before, someone who doesn't have income, I definitely try to avoid as much as possible putting them into those grants, knowing that it's almost inevitable that they're going to be returning to homelessness. So most providers, I think, don't have that luxury. And so I absolutely tried as much to avoid that as a provider, but it absolutely is a huge factor in someone returning to homelessness because they're not ready. We know they're not ready, but good luck, you know.
And just to lean on that, like and why we're doing this way, because I've gotten to sit alongside Randy and Andrew as they've processed through this data. And this is the first committee that the data is going to for a very specific reason. It's a committee full of providers who can take what Randy and Andrew were saying and really bring it to life right there. So if the anecdote matches what the data is saying, we have a track to follow. And it seems like that rapid rehousing, I would also say we want to look at probably the combination of volume and high rate. So even though Rapid's returning people at a 22% rate, which is less than the overall system of 24%, it's got a really high volume and it's a much higher percentage than PSH, even though PSH serves a higher acuity client, which is correlated with higher return rate. So it really does spotlight Rapid. So I'm just leaning in on that, Nicole, because again, your anecdote matches what the data is saying. And the value for other providers to share their insights similarly. Like what else are you seeing from your perspective? Well, then I'll state an obvious one, emergency shelter. One of the things that and I love the purity of the data analytics work group in this sense, and Andrew really emphasized this, not looking at particular providers, but the populations that providers are serving, and finding the correlation between emergency shelter, which I think we know serves a much higher acuity client or individual, and then their high return rates. So they've got the combination of very high volume and very high return rate, 6% above the return average, and far more returns. So just for our system's sake, that would be a place that might bear a lot of fruit if we put a lot of attention into that.
Has anyone heard about, I'm going to bounce back to Rapid real quick. Has anyone heard about clients or former participants struggling with the lease renewal, like rent goes up and they can't afford it anymore or something like that? Just anecdotally, has anyone heard?
Marcy McFarland from Home Inc. And yes, so as someone is either exited from their provider, their rapid rehousing program, they will usually reach out to us at Home Inc. When they get their lease renewal, and they see the rent increase, they can't afford it and they want to come back on through the program. So they're asking us, how do they get more assistance from Home Inc? And we explain, that they need to talk with their providers, their original providers. So we see that every day, literally every day, and have for several months. And I know that, our team is working with UMOM and A New Leaf and CBI on addressing those issues. So, but yes, it is as they're coming up on their lease renewal, because most properties start that process about 60 out from their annual renewal. So that's when they're starting to panic because they know that they're not going to be able to afford. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
This is Nicole from UMOM. And Katie, I think, spoke to this as well in the question related to the PIT count, but especially our first time homeless population that we're seeing a higher rate of first time homeless. And it's almost exclusively a situation where they weren't evicted from their previous housing. They just simply couldn't afford the rent hike and then couldn't find something affordable in time. So what is out there, just period, is very limited. So finding housing when a lease is coming up on end so that there's an overlap. So I don't have a place where I have a place to go, right? So coordinating that 60-day window or that 30-day window to sync up with another unit that's available is an issue. And then on top of it, finding something that's affordable. So just clients being priced out. So they're coming to us, again, they paid their rent on time, had no issues, weren't evicted, have a clean record. So an ideal renter in the eyes of a property manager, however, just couldn't afford to stay where they were at.
Yeah. So I'll bounce over to our recommendations and, I'll get y'all's take now, but, we sort of blazed through a lot of, graphs and charts and just threw them up in front of you. So, whatever comes up now is fine, but also, you all can discuss more on your own and circle back with us, or, we whatever we need, or can go from there. So I'm just going to run through what we saw so far, based on, and then this is also based on what we spoke about just now as well. So it's my understanding that a lot of those, what we talked about, a lot of those rapid rehousing funder applied like subsidy barriers, a lot of them have been removed. So I guess maybe this is like validation that work was worthwhile or valuable, maybe. Is there still more work to be done here?
I would say based on just what Nicole said, yes.
Yeah.
And potentially to to spread the word of anything that's been done in the ESG committee to emphasize lengthening the time of voucher, to make sure that all the local funders have that information, and then the providers being funded by those funders have that information, so that it's not just locked into that ESG committee vault. I don't know if that's the case or not, but that's something to chase up.
And it might be something we could include in the LMS, just as we are establishing best practices.
Good call.
So is it the case right now that for COC funded or ESG funded that we already do follow-ups post-program to rapid rehousing?
Yeah, we do 6-month post-exit follow-up for those that exit to permanent housing. So what that looks like is just checking in with the client to see if there's a need for additional assistance, and if possible, contacting the landlord just to see if they are current and if they are still in the unit. It can be difficult to connect. Obviously, you know, the email and text is usually the highest likelihood of connection, but it is happening. And again, there are programs, like homeless prevention that are there as an option for those programs, maybe that are ending immediately and have to end at 9 months. And ideally, you're not trying to throw someone from one program directly into another, and trying to save those programs for people who are more stable and who need it, not just someone who needs 10 or 11 months of rapid rehousing. But that exit follow-up is really key, because we can then put them into like a homeless prevention program to keep them from returning back into the system.
Is that 6-month follow-up program driven, or is that universal across all RRH programs?
It's funder driven. So
Okay.
funders who specifically require it. I mean, for us, it's just easier to do it for everyone, because if we've got to do it for like 2/3, it's just, So
Yeah.
usually what ends up happening with most providers is some people require it, so it's just easier to do it across the board.
Right, but some providers do not necessarily require that. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yeah, there are some smaller funders, I think, who don't require the 6-month exit follow-up.
Okay.
Nicole, you mentioned that we can use homeless prevention funds can, under certain circumstances, be helpful. So you've seen, I mean, under those certain circumstances, you've seen it be successful in helping a former rapid client retain their unit or retain their lease.
Yeah, it definitely can. It can be tricky because there are, as the contract stands now, I know things are going to change, hopefully in this next round, but as it stands now, there are still a lot of limitations with homeless prevention funds that we have, which is the ESG funds. So they can't have over 30% AMI, which is extremely low. So if they have over 30% income, AMI, we can't even provide assistance to them. So there are a lot of still limiting factors to the use of those funds that can kind of complicate it and slow the process, because there's several screening things that have to happen. But when it does happen and it does connect, it's kind of the perfect solution to those that most often they have the income, they can pay their rent, but maybe they missed a shift and they got behind. So they just need help catching up and kind of getting back on their feet, buying themselves a little bit of time. And it absolutely has saved people in their units.
Cool. Are there any shelter providers in the room who've maybe had some thoughts about, you know, about the exits, returns from emergency shelter, the higher rate of returns? And then the one thing specific that we saw was that these exit destinations to friends and family really, especially for shelter, were just associated with higher returns. Like that doesn't seem surprising, I imagine. Does anyone have a reaction to that?
This is Richard. So I mean, it definitely, you know, to go back to Co-Chair Smith's point, I think this piece around emergency shelter is the one that like bears, like if we were digging into some space, like rapid is one of them, but also like if we did work around emergency shelter, we would move the needle. Like it's one of the greatest opportunities for us to move the needle as more people return to homelessness from emergency shelter than I think any other space combined when we look at the numbers. And so it bears us digging into that and having more conversation around that, around why is it not working? Is it about the philosophies of the emergency shelters, or is it about like who comes into emergency shelter? And as a result of that, that's why we see more folks return in that particular space. So I think like that's something that we have to dig into. And then also like looking at that specifically and how you've broken it down across demographics. But like if we just look at what the demographics of this population of this 1,857 individuals that return, like looking at that, because then we can design interventions around that. Because while in the system, we may see a lot of equity in terms of how it's, or not equity, but proportionality, we may see that this 1857 is actually, and then I would do the same thing when it comes to rapid as well, right? That these particular numbers are disproportionate when it comes to who's returning back into homelessness from these two interventions.
Right.
And it may look very similar to what we've seen because of like these are the majority of the numbers, but I think like it still bears, you know, if data is a flashlight, then this is where the lighthouse is, right? To be able to point us to that direction.
Yeah, and that's totally possible with the data setup we have here too. So it's just about getting the right people who can interpret it and provide the appropriate context. That's totally possible.
I know we're running short on time, and there's clearly a lot to process here. Randy said it right. Like I think some of our best reactions will come from taking this back and sitting down with it and really thinking through it, and then coming back maybe to our next COC committee meeting prepared to discuss some more around this. And then also, which we'll talk about in the next agenda item, the Connecting to Other Systems of Care work group is working through this at a deeper level as well. So that'd be another place for members of the committee to come and bring some deeper ideas that we have. And also just to touch on something that Richard, Co-Chair Cruz just said, that so you see that Randy typed demographic specific to emergency shelter. So the data analytics work group, first of all, has limited time. So let's all remember that they're like us. but can serve in a consultative role. So we always come to these points where we wonder what's the data behind the data, what's the meaning behind the data, what are we really looking at? And this is a place where we may be able to ask some of those questions around these returns specifically, and have some folks who can look into it, interpret it, and bring it back to us. So so there's a shift happening. They've done the data work, and they're passing it on to us to do the stuff with the data, but we can come back to them for data consultation. But because of time limitations, Randy, Andrew, would you like to close us out? Do you have anything you'd like to say in closing?
Only that in your agenda packet, we have the slides that the main slides that Randy went through, as well as a handout that more concisely has our takeaways if you need to reference that. And thank you so much for giving us this time today.
Yeah, thanks, y'all.
Great work. Thank you, gentlemen. So we're gonna move on to the next agenda item, connecting to other systems of care update. Decreasing returns to homelessness was identified as part of the Maricopa Regional Continuum of Care's system performance measures. In order to accomplish this goal, I'll discuss the current work being done in the work group and how to better focus efforts to increase connections to other systems of care. So basically, we've in that work group had a conversation around what are the systems of care that we're looking to address, that we want to look further into, and that we want to plug gaps around. And the conversation was, are we thinking more internal systems of care or external systems of care? And what we mean by that, are we talking about things within the homeless service system specifically, or those other parts that touch the homeless service system? So things like hospitals, criminal justice, stuff like that. And because from the board strategic plan, the idea was that we would be looking at other systems of care within the context of returns to homelessness. We made the decision to focus more on the in-house. So in other words, let's focus our attention first and foremost on those systems of care within the homeless service system that may have gaps before expanding out further to those gaps between homeless services and other systems. So in other words, concrete decision number one, let's focus on internal systems of care and find the gaps therein. So then we are looking through the data that you just saw. So it's way different, like if I go through it versus if Randy goes through it. So we did a very poor man's version of this earlier in the week. And kind of some of the things that stood out to us, obviously, were rapid rehousing, street outreach, and emergency shelter are places where we're starting to zero in. I would say based on the PIC count and the system performance measures, I would add thoughts around subpopulations like seniors. And we need to talk more about probably mental illness and things like that. So right now the next concrete thing is to settle on the gap to focus on. And then what does it mean to focus on it will be concrete thing thereafter. So we're just trying to make decisions, keep the ball moving. And we are going to be meeting on correct me if I'm wrong, Haley, but the first Wednesday at 10 o'clock every month from here on. So we'll get the calendar invitations out. There's recurring invitations for everyone. And momentum is building, so please join.
Just one thing to add to that. While this work group is off of the committee, you do not have to be part of the committee to be on the work group. So anybody out there watching our YouTube channel, if you're interested in joining our work group, please email me and I will get you added to that invitation. Thank you.
Well, is it back? No, or are you holding it? Okay.
We're going to keep it moving. If you have any other comments, please share them in another format. Moving on to the next agenda item.
Okay. Yes. So we're at request for future agenda items. Do committee members have any action or discussion items for future meetings? So I just want to plant a seed, and I just don't want us to forget about it by next year, is that when we're in session, we should always have the legislative update as a part of the meeting, even if that means we have to give a little more time to the meeting. But the legislative update, there's a lot of things going on right now. And so it's just good for us to have that as a part of the meeting. I know it's in the consent agenda, it's in the packet, all that great stuff. But I just think it's good for us to hear, for those of us that are more auditory, for us to be able to get that information, process through that information, ask questions about that information. And I have a request around the coalition being present to give that update as well. Dylan, you do a great job, but I'm so no shade. Just saying, like, the coalition should be present to actually tell us the work that they're really doing and that we need to be paying attention to. As like I said, right now, like where like, you know, Monday came out and they were like, oh, there's all these wonderful things that are in the budget. And it's like, okay, like let's talk about it. So just want to plant that seed there for way future agenda items.
The budget may be passed by the time this meeting's over.
Yeah, that's my point. I'm just saying. So that's what, like, not for next month. Like, that's something for us to think about for next year. Okay. Any other things that people want to have on the agenda for future agenda items? Okay. And then lastly, do we have any questions, or do we have any comments from the committee? Anything that anyone, any highlights, any events people want to raise, things people need to know?
If no one else does, staff does have a couple announcements.
Go ahead.
We are having a second coordinated entry evaluation review meeting on May 18th at 3 p.m. More information is going to be sent out and it will be posted on the MAG website's events calendar for registration. So if you're interested in that, please register. And then also, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who has participated so far in our stakeholders gaps analysis meetings. They've been super successful and I've loved hearing from all of you guys. We will be holding our third and final meeting on Tuesday, May 16th at 10 a.m. It'll be held in person only here at MAG. So if you're interested in attending and didn't already get the invite, please reach out to me and I will send that over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay. If nothing else, this meeting is adjourned. Have a great day.